When I was a kid, every summer my mother would take me to my grandmother's house to visit her. I was always excited because she would always tell me such interesting stories. Because my mother had a lot of work to do in the city and would return here to pick me up in 2 weeks, my grandma immediately told me a very interesting story to console me. Her family was a wealthy family in the area at the time, and she was very attractive. That was why, despite the fact that she was only 16 years old, many people approached her for matchmaking. One day, a family approached the matchmaker and asked her to assist them in proposing to marry my grandmother. After the matchmaker spoke with her father, which was my great-grandfather, he seemed to be pleased with the other family, so he cheerfully told her to set a date for the two sides to meet. A few days later, the other family made an appointment to meet, and the two families enjoyed some tea and a joyful conversation. Fortunately, the couple fell in love with each other at the first sight. They couldn't take their eyes off each other and decided to come together. He rode a donkey to meet her every few days. Because the two villages were quite far apart and he had to cross a forest, sometimes he was simply going to see her for a few minutes and then giving her a cake or a small gift just to see her. Then he hurried back home on his donkey, because if he stayed any longer the journey back would be even more dangerous. The two agreed to meet again a few days before the wedding. He rummaged through his pockets and began to pull something out. After a while of searching, he pulled out a beautiful and sparkling golden hairpin from his shirt. He stated that this would be an engagement gift, and that when he picked her up as a bride, he would like her to bring it along. She was both surprised and moved by this. The hairpin was exquisitely sculpted, resembling a flower in full bloom. She didn't dare to use it because it was too beautiful. Part of her wanted to keep it for the consummation night, so she carefully stored it in a wooden box lined with red fabric. Soon after, the wedding day arrived. She put on stunning makeup and a crimson bridal gown. Her hand was still holding the box containing the gold hairpin as she sat on the bride's palanquin. There were drums and trumpets outside making cheerful sounds, and her brother followed to take her to the husband's house. Suddenly, she heard her brother talking loudly outside. She realized the group was being pursued by robbers. Her brother advised her to stay inside and never go outside because he was concerned about her. Despite her fears, she made sure to carefully place the box containing the gold brooch in the sealed trunk under the bride's chair. Because she was too worried, she secretly lifted the curtain and peered outside to see how things were going. At the time, she noticed that in addition to the bride's procession group, there were some other strange men, that the two sides were fighting fiercely, and that the robbers were extremely daring. However, it appeared that the bandits were weaker, so after a while they were quickly defeated by the bride procession group and her brother. She was relieved to see this, so she closed the curtain and sat down on the chair to relax. Soon after, she couldn't hear the noise outside anymore, and the palanquin began to move and was lifted. She assumed that the robbery issue had been resolved, but because everyone was so quiet, she inquired outside. But no one responded. Instead, the sound of drums continued, but it was not lively as it had been. She was terrified as she listened closely, because the drum trumpet was no longer playing happy songs, but rather funeral music. She hastily opened the curtains to look outside and look for her brother, feeling increasingly strange. The person carrying the palanquin in front of her, however, was not at all like the original group. His hairstyle and even his clothes were unusual, which surprised her. What was more terrifying was that the people carrying the palanquin had no legs at all, as if they were floating through the air. One of them turned to look at her after hearing the noise coming from the palanquin. Now she could clearly see his face was pale and looked like swords, and his eyes were lifeless. It terrified her so much that she screamed and retreated into the palanquin, not daring to look. They didn't seem to care about her and continued to carry the palanquin forward. In fear, she jumped out of the palanquin, hoping no one would notice. Therefore, she slipped and fell, landing on the road with her head hit on a roadside stone. It caused her head to bleed profusely, as well as fatigue in her body. Despite the fact that she could now flee, she recalled the golden hairpin he had given her, which was still in the palanquin. With tears in her eyes, she decided to take another risk and return to find the group of people who were carrying the palanquin. They didn't seem to notice or care that she had jumped out of the palanquin. Except for their frightening appearances, everything appeared to be a normal wedding ceremony with trumpets and drums and music. Someone was still carrying a large wooden trunk containing dowry behind them. But these people looked scary. Also, their skin was grey, their eyes were white with no irises. They appeared lifeless. It was a wedding ceremony, but it was a gloomy one. So she kept a low profile, hiding behind the bushes on the side of the road so no one would notice. The palanquin was also stopped and placed on the ground after more than 30 minutes. On closer inspection, however, this area seemed to be a mass burial area with numerous large and small graves. They gathered in front of the largest of them all and dug with their hands. The outer layer of soil and rock was removed, revealing a large coffin within. They took a gold hairpin box and placed it above the coffin. It was like returning items to their rightful owner. Finally, they filled the tomb with dirt to return to its original state, bowed a few times and then vanished. Hiding behind, she was watching everything and feeling extremely strange and curious. They had almost no intention of harming her. However, witnessing such a strange thing made her extremely scared, intending to follow to retrieve the gold hair pin, but it had now been buried inside the grave. So she fled in the opposite direction, hoping to run to join her bride possession group or someone who could assist her. Finally, she didn't know how long she ran for, possibly more than an hour, when she met her brother, who was looking for her everywhere because she had suddenly vanished. She finally dared to breathe a sigh of relief and hug her brother as soon as she saw him. Then she told her brother everything, and she wanted the entire group to accompany her to find the graves. However, for some reason, the group searched for a long time but did not discover any of the graves she described. Because things did not go as planned, both families agreed to reschedule the wedding ceremony for a more auspicious date. Following the marriage ceremony, the couple was required to go and greet elderly members of the husband's family to whom they related the events of the previous day. So he suddenly remembered an old story, most likely related to the incident of the bride procession group. In the past, this land had a young king who ruled cruelly, making people miserable. But his reign was brief, and he died when he was just over 40 years old. The people who lived there began to disperse and moved to other villages and lands to live. A large tomb was built for him, but no one took care of it. According to legend, the gold hair pin was left to him by his late wife and was buried with him when he died. However, because no one cared for him, his grave was soon dug up by grave robbers who stole the golden hairpin. Coincidentally, she brought the hairpin and passed by near the grave on the day of the wedding. Perhaps they had been looking for the hairpin for a long time, as it was also the object of the old owner. This heartbreaking story took place in a small city in the north. The pitiful but also blameworthy person in this story was a boy named Beto. The boy's mother died early in an accident, so he lived with his father. At first, the father and son's life was very peaceful and happy, but a year later, his father married a new wife and his life also started to be sad from that point on. Since his stepmother moved in together, Beto was beaten and scolded by his father, even though his father had never done it before. On the contrary, Beto's father always loved his new wife very much. Sometimes later, Beto learned that his stepmother was pregnant. The quarrels between him and his father became more and more intense. In the eyes of Beto's father now, he was a rebellious and stubborn boy who was disruptive. In Beto's heart, there was only one mother. He did not accept and allow the stepmother to take the place of his mother. Time flew. The stepmother's belly was getting bigger and bigger. One day, after his father and stepmother went shopping together for the baby, they also bought Beto a clothed doll. Beto saw the gift, but he did not feel happy. On the contrary, he became angrier because he thought his stepmother was deliberately humiliating him, assuming that he had the same hobbies as girls. Afraid of affecting the fetus and affecting his wife, Beto's father silently threatened to force him to learn to be obedient if Beto did not want his pocket money to be cut. Because Beto didn't want to be with his stepmother, he made excuses to eat outside every day. Without pocket money, he wouldn't be able to live. Beto reluctantly accepted the doll and sadly went back to his room. He couldn't hide his anger, so he slammed the door in front of his father and stepmother. Outside, the father and stepmother were also tired of Beto's ignorant and disrespectful behavior. After entering the room, Beto directly threw the doll on the ground and cried silently on the bed. At this time, he felt very lonely and sad. Beto cried out alone for an hour and fell asleep because he was tired. The following morning, when Beto woke up, he saw the doll sitting on the ground. The more he looked at it, the more sulky Beto felt. He angrily picked up the doll and was about to throw it out. As soon as he went to the door, Beto saw his stepmother going somewhere. The hatred in the boy's heart began to rise. Beto suddenly had an idea and threw the doll towards his stepmother. He immediately called his stepmother and asked her to help pick up the doll. The stepmother turned her head when she heard Beto's voice and couldn't help but be surprised to see that the doll she gave Beto yesterday was lying at her feet. Seeing that his stepmother didn't say anything nor react, Beto pretended to care about his stepmother and said he would pick it up himself. Seeing that, the stepmother thought that Beto had accepted her, so she was happy and wanted to pick up the doll for him. After saying that, she slowly bent down to pick up the doll. Beto also took the opportunity to sneak around behind his stepmother's back. Then Beto quickly pushed the stepmother's back with his hand. Due to loss of balance, the stepmother fell forward. Because her belly was too big, it hit the ground hard. The stepmother began to feel severe abdominal pain, then fainted from loss of blood. At this point, under her body was all blood, and the baby in her belly was dead. The blood flowed out in a stream and stuck to the doll next to it. Beto looked at his stepmother lying on the ground, a satisfied smile on the corner of his mouth. At that time, the boy felt happy that no one could take his father anymore. Beto hurriedly picked up the doll and hurriedly left. Then he threw the doll in the corner of the room where no one else could find it. Next, he pretended to be the first person to spot the injured person and called for an ambulance. After taking the stepmother to the hospital, Beto became a hero. Because the doctors all said that if it came a little later, the mother's life could not be saved. Although the fetus died, Beto's stepmother was fine. Beto's father immediately wanted to buy some food to nourish his wife. He also told Beto to take care of his stepmother. Beto's father didn't wait for him to answer, then hurriedly left, leaving Beto alone in the emergency room. Beto looked at the shadow of his father was far away. Suddenly, he felt extremely scared. He was worried that if his stepmother woke up, the truth would be surely exposed. Beto went inside and took a sneak peek. At this time, the stepmother woke up and couldn't help but mourn for the dead baby. Beto saw the fruit knife next to him. He suddenly had a desire to kill, because he was afraid that his father would kill him if he knew everything. Without thinking too much, Beto made up his mind. He took the fruit knife and went to his stepmother's bed. When she heard footsteps, the stepmother looked up and broke down in tears when she saw Beto holding the knife. Beto walked to the bed, only called his stepmother's name once, and suddenly smiled a ghostly smile. That smile scared the stepmother. She knew the one pushing her was Beto. She didn't expect Beto to be so scary. In the situation, Beto was also extremely worried and hesitant about whether to stab his stepmother to death or not. Although she hated Beto very much, the child in her stomach was also lost. The stepmother said she did not intend to denounce Beto and promised to tell everyone she accidentally fell. Just when Beto hesitated and his stepmother was scared, his father suddenly shouted from behind. Beto turned his head in surprise, knowing that he had been discovered. Beto pretended to say that he just wanted to peel apples for his stepmother to eat. However, Beto's father could not believe his explanation because there were no fruits in the room. The father ordered Beto to give him the knife immediately. Holding the knife behind him, Beto tried to cut his hand with the knife. Seeing the blood dripping, Beto's stepmother understood what he meant. She did not want to break the relationship between father and son, so she explained that she wanted to eat apples but later realized there were no apples in the room. Beto's father immediately believed his wife and said nothing more, gently telling Beto to return home first. Beto rushed home because he didn't dare and didn't want to stay in the hospital anymore. After Beto left, the stepmother hugged Beto's father to relieve the pain in her heart. She also did not tell Beto's crimes to his father. At home, Beto also felt tormented and scared. He was afraid of his stepmother telling the truth and afraid of being sent to a reformatory for criminal children. But after that, everything was fine. A month later, Beto's stepmother was discharged from the hospital, but they did not return home. Later, Beto learned that his father and stepmother had bought another house and started a new life without him. Beto's father would transfer money to him once a month. All Beto's living expenses were covered by his father. When he saw his father leave, Beto was heartbroken. Now Beto felt that the world no longer loved him. Over time, Beto began to live alone. One day, after returning from school, Beto saw the doll he had thrown away lying at the door. The doll still had blood on it, and Beto immediately thought that maybe it was his stepmother who brought it to scare him. Beto didn't even look at the doll. He kicked it away and went into the house. Late at night, when Beto went to sleep, he had a strange dream. In the dream, Beto was chased by a child. The child kept asking Beto to play with him, making Beto extremely scared. Although he could not see the child talking, Beto could completely hear its voice coming from his brain. Chased by the child, Beto risked his life to run forward despite the endless space ahead. While Beto was deep asleep, the doll he kicked in the afternoon suddenly entered the room and stood staring at him in the dark. The doll then jumped onto Beto's face, covering his nose, mouth, and using its weight, causing him to suffocate. 2 days later, Beto's father tried to call home several times, but he didn't receive a reply. His father decided to go back home to check it out, and he found out Beto was dead. Beto's eyes, nose, and mouth were all covered with cotton wool. Beto's corpse was so scary that it haunted his father for a long time. Beto's father called the police soon after, and after the police investigated, they did not find any trace of the perpetrator. Therefore, the case was still unfinished. Everyone then focused on Beto's corpse, but no one noticed that in the corner of the room, there was an abandoned doll. It showed a very strange smile. It had a face like a baby and was crying silently. No one knew that inside the doll lived another world, and Beto's soul had been trapped there. Time later, Beto's death still torments Beto's father and stepmother. They only blame themselves for the carelessness that caused the death of their poor son. It occurred in the spring of 2001, and it became a very well-known story that year. There was a very wealthy family in the village, and the oldest son, Shen, celebrated a big wedding with a village girl named Lan. The wedding was grand and crowded, with many attending to bless the bride and groom. The groom's friends began to tease as well, as if it were a ritual before allowing the two to get into the wedding room for consummation. On the bride's side, some friends and bridesmaids had come to celebrate, so they took advantage of the opportunity to chat with the bride before she officially joined her husband's house. At first, it was just a fun conversation, but then Shen's friends began getting drunk and making fun of the groom, which became increasingly outrageous. They were no longer teasing only the bride, but rather the bridesmaids, who were also in the room. They also forced her to make some pretty subtle jokes. Everyone was drunk at the moment, so the bride couldn't stop the groom's friends. But just as everyone was making a lot of noise, a friend of the bride, who was also a bridesmaid at the wedding, burst out of the next room. People didn't understand what was going on when they saw her crying and screaming and fled quickly. Her name was May. She ran out of the house before anyone could ask about the situation. Her clothes were strewn about, and her hair was a mess. Everyone was still stunned, but inside the room a friend of the groom was Wu. His face was red, possibly from inebriation. He was not wearing a shirt and was still holding his pants, and he was also perplexed. Wu appeared to have had a bad intention towards May when he saw her sleeping in the bride's room while being drunk, causing her to panic. The bride was furious and scolded him. Everything was serious, but Wu still believed that it wasn't as exaggerated as the bride claimed to be. He was simply drunk, and he blamed May for lying in that room with such a revealing dress on. Hearing this, the bride became enraged, chasing May while turning around to curse Wu. Because May was getting married next month, Wu's actions would jeopardize her honor. Following that, both the bride and the groom dashed out to find May, afraid of that something bad would happen to her while running out this late. May, on the other hand, ran quickly to the forest. She was a very sensitive person, and Lan was afraid that she would have done something reckless. So Lan enlisted the help of everyone to find her. Everyone then raced to find May. This area was quite dark and large, and the longer it took, the more worried Lan became about her friend. People looked for her for half an hour, but couldn't find her. Everyone was talking about going deeper into the forest. After a while of searching, there were results, but what they saw in front of them caused everyone to panic and bewilder. May hanged herself on a tree branch with only her lingerie on, possibly because it was too humiliating and made her consider suicide. Everyone was terrified when they saw the scene. In the dark night, a flashlight flickered, casually shining directly on May's face, revealing the terrifying face of a hanged man, tongue sticking out, eyes opened wide and full of blood veins, looking extremely terrified. That angry face and eyes seemed to be looking directly at Wu, who had just done bad things to May. Following that, Wu was arrested for the crime of indirectly causing death and causing mental damage to the deceased's family. However, having lots of relationships and bribe money, he was released the next day because they thought May purposefully committed suicide, which caused outrage among the villagers, but he didn't care and went straight home. It rained heavily that night, and despite the fact that he raped May, he had a wife. His wife began questioning and blaming him as soon as he returned home. The two had a heated argument. The wife couldn't accept his behavior and accused him of being such a terrible man. His parents couldn't stand up for him in this situation, All they could do was give up as they watched the couple squabble. The wife was sobbing while talking, but he neither seemed to mind nor felt bad about it. The more she talked, the more irritated he became, and his wife couldn't take it any longer, so she proposed divorce. He agreed right away, without hesitation. His parents, who were standing outside, were equally impatient and concerned because divorce was no minor issue. If they divorced, it would be extremely difficult to find a new husband for her. However, according to the father, it was his fault, not his wife's. Everyone in this village realized he made a terrible mistake, so no one dared to be with him. His parents heard rash voices continuing from inside the room while he was worried and confused. They thought Wu and his wife were arguing again, so they peered into the room through the glass to keep an eye on them. They only saw the daughter-in-law sitting on the bed, holding her head with both hands, her mouth muttering something inaudible, and she looked like in great pain. They assumed it was because Wu had beaten his wife. Otherwise, why was she holding her head in such pain? But when they looked closely, they panicked. The wife's entire face began to change, becoming strange and frightening. Her body turned pale, her face was green, and her tongue was protruding over her chin. She approached Wu with a resentful expression. Wu had also begun to doze off at this point, so he had no idea what was going on behind his back. His parents stood outside, being aware of that something was wrong, and attempted to wake up Wu by banging on the window. Hearing the noise, he began to roll over, but his eyes remained closed. The wife was now very close to Wu. It was too late by the time he could wake up and open his eyes. His wife was standing right next to him, looking at his wife's face now. He immediately remembered May's face when she was hanged to death. His parents were also eager to enter the room to assist their son, knowing that the wife has been possessed by May. They were nervously screaming, knowing that this was the ghost coming back for revenge, which usually never ended well. So they burst in through the main door and dashed inside the house to the couple's bedroom door. The father tried repeatedly banging on the door and calling out his son's name, but there was no response from the inside. After several attempts to bang on the door without success, the father decided to use force to smash through it. Fortunately, the door was made of wood and was relatively thin, so they were able to get inside after a few hits. However, the scene in front of them caused them extreme panic. The Wu couple was currently on the bed with large puddles of blood splattered all over the room. The mother cried pitifully. Looked like Wu was stabbed and cut by a sharp knife, and the wife passed out on the bed, still clutching a large knife. The two rushed Wu to the hospital, but even if he arrived quickly, Wu would not be able to survive due to excessive blood loss. The news of Wu's death quickly spread throughout the village, and almost no one sympathized as a result, believing that this was the retribution he deserved. People usually come to help at funerals or weddings in the village, but no one did this time. Instead, they stood outside, curiously. After that, the mother went insane and spent her days wandering on the streets looking for her child. And the wife was imprisoned. While being there, she went insane because she couldn't remember why she had killed her husband in such a way. It happened in 1996 in a small city in Hong Kong. This story was also a famous strange case at that time. Mr. Ma was a security guard at an old apartment building. Evenings were always his best time. Because it was summer, the day was very hot and muggy, but the night was cooler and more pleasant. There was nothing better than sitting in the wind and drinking a glass of wine. After placing the pot of fragrant lamb stew on the table, Mr. Ma was very happy and refreshed, so he poured a glass of wine and was ready to sip. But suddenly something fell from above very quickly and directly into his mutton pot. The broth and even the lamb was splattered all over the table, which greatly annoyed Mr. Ma. He didn't know who could be so careless, blatantly throwing trash down, so he looked up and started cursing. But there was absolutely no movement above. Everything was still quiet. No one answered him. He thought they must be afraid of being scolded by Mr. Ma, so they deliberately ignored him. But just a few minutes later, from the fourth floor, something suddenly fell again, which was black and slightly round. Thinking that the other person would continue to throw trash on the ground, Mr. Ma was very attentive to what was falling to catch the other guy. However, the thing that fell was something he couldn't believe, because it was a human head. It flew from above very quickly. This thing made him panic. He had never encountered a situation like this before. The head fell straight onto the table, hitting Mr. Ma's pot of lamb, sending everything flying everywhere. He was also surprised to the point of immobilization. At this point, Mr. Ma could only watch the mess in front of him, his eyes white with fear. The head belonged to a woman. Because of blood loss, her skin had turned pale. Next to the head was a human hand, so it was clear that what had fallen before was a human hand. At this point, Mr. Ma wanted to run away, but his legs were numb. So, he backed up and fell back and still staring at the head on the table. In the end, Mr. Ma gathered all his strength to scream out loud to everyone for help. After Mr. Ma's screams, everyone gathered and called the police. The police car was present at the scene where the head fell within minutes. Hearing Mr. Ma's statement, the police began to surround the room to prepare to arrest the perpetrator. But when standing in front of the room, the policeman suddenly saw something very strange. That's the door to the room that didn't close. It's still open. Could the killer have run away? If not, he probably didn't know what fear was. However, the policemen were also very cautious. They stood by the door and peered inside the room through the half-open door. But what was inside made them suddenly startled. The strong smell of blood gushing out from inside the dark room with only a little light. A man was sitting on the sofa with a gloomy expression, surrounded by blood, stretching from the wall to his clothes to the floor. On the floor was a large knife. The type used to cut meat was also lying in a pool of blood. It seemed that this was the weapon that the man used to kill people. The policeman stood in front of him, even pointed a gun at his head to control him, but he still did not resist or explain anything. His eyes were empty and lifeless, his face dark and extremely sad. It was worth mentioning that he kept staring at the TV without blinking. Something was attracting him more than the fact that he had just killed someone. The strangest thing was that there were no programs on TV. So what was he looking at? And what made him like that? The TV continued to make squeaks, and the screen was only filled with black and white dots as if the signal was lost. The police then went looking for clues around the house. They discovered the body of a woman without a head sitting in the kitchen. This must be the body of the head that had fallen on Mr. Ma's table. Inside the bedroom was the body of a boy, about 10 years old, whose head was also beheaded. But his head was left not far away, not thrown out. Because this case shocked the people and the press, the police couldn't take it lightly. They immediately set up a team to investigate everything. The man was also taken to the police station to get a bow. His face remained the same, still wide open eyes and gloomy. After interrogation, what the police received was only a statement that the devil had made him. He did not know what he had just done. But of course, the police did not believe it. The police wanted him to tell everything because there was no such thing as being manipulated by the devil, like he said. He also began to recount everything that night. He had no reason to kill his wife and son. It was a day off for the couple, so they both took their son out to play. Then the whole family returned home just after dark. Arriving at home, everyone was tired. The wife decided to go to the kitchen to cut some fruit and bring it to the living room so that the whole family could watch TV while resting. The son went straight to the bedroom to play, and he just sat in the living room watching TV, waiting for his wife. On TV was showing a program excavating ancient tombs, was also a popular program recently. But for a while the TV suddenly blurred and the sound also started to crack. It seemed that the signal was lost. After that, the image of the other program also disappeared completely, replaced by black and white dots and shrill squeaks. But in that squeak it seemed to be a whispering voice, telling the man to kill his family and cut off their heads. And for some reason his mind went blank, and then his body began to do what the voice commanded. Just like that, he killed his family exactly the way the voice on the television said. He did not understand why he did it, but at that time he was no longer aware of anything. Hearing this, of course, the policeman would not believe it. There was no way that a strange voice coming from the TV could command someone to kill people like that. Perhaps he had a long quarrel with his wife, or he was an abuser. The investigation lasted nearly a month, but no matter what method the police used, he only gave one way. The same answer. No matter how menacing or soft-spoken the man was still the same, and he seemed to be very sure of his words. The police also reached out to neighbors and people who knew him to investigate, but according to the results, he had no reason to kill his family. Their whole family lived together very happily. Everyone knew it. But among the neighbors' testimonies, many said strange things had happened recently, since some people had unearthed an ancient tomb near this area. The people believed that perhaps it has accidentally released something bad, or a curse of some kind. Of course, the police wouldn't take out those stories to write about the case because the husband himself admitted to killing his family. So he couldn't defend him for such spiritual reasons. Finally, he was sentenced to death for his cruel behavior, and whether the truth was what he told or not, no one would ever know. Captain Chow was summoned urgently that morning. He rushed to the headquarters. It was too crowded in the morning to get from the dormitory to the headquarters, so he couldn't take a cab. He had to run, which made him sweat a lot. Everyone could see that there was a serious case that required Captain Chow's attention, which was why he was in such a hurry. And as expected, as soon as he walked into the office, Boss Lu Feng asked him to lead some people to the end of the town. Captain Chow wanted to learn more about the case so that it could be handled efficiently. According to the village newspaper, there had been many disappearances and murders in recent days, said Boss Lu Feng. Was it because of a wild animal? Captain asked. According to reports, the culprit was the ghost of an elderly woman and her cat. This surprised the captain because despite having seen many strange cases, the ghost of an old woman and a cat could kill people still very shockingly. People were currently confused because it was a remote village. People believed the police wouldn't care, so they might act quickly to assist people. When Captain Chow heard this, he immediately took orders and set off. He and his comrades went to village in casual clothes to make the quest easier. When they arrived, the village chief greeted them enthusiastically and cheerfully. The captain went straight to the point and inquired about the case. On the way, the chief told them that the story began with an old woman named Lang, and that when she died, everything had changed. She was over 70 years old this year and lived with a son and daughter-in-law, but the son frequently worked far away and the daughter-in-law frequently cursed at her. Because she was an elderly woman, she often wet her pants with urine unconsciously. The daughter-in-law was so frustrated that she had to do the laundry all day, so she yelled at her constantly. She could only keep quiet when she heard that she was too old and her living only made her children and grandchildren unhappy. The only thing that brought her comfort was her cat, what had been with her for over 10 years. She hugged the cat and went into the room that day, but she didn't go out of the room the next day. The son came home from work and heard that his mother was still in the room, so he went in to find and comfort her. He believed that his wife was just talking nonsense and that his mother didn't need to pay attention to that. He opened the door and walked in, but the scene in front of him astounded him. The old woman hanged herself in her room, probably to not burden her children. The cat, what was lying beneath her body, also stared at him angrily and hissed in a frightening manner. It then darted past him and fled. He took his mother's body down quickly and bemoaned the fact that he did not take better care of her. He cried a lot at this point because he thought he was so unfaithful that his mother had to commit suicide. But no matter how much he cried, his mother could not be revived. But it looked like his mother didn't want to die. Her eyes remained open wide and filled with hatred. Because the funeral required extensive preparations, her body was still kept in the house. That night, the wife was gathering firewood to cook. All of a sudden, she screamed out because she saw something. When the husband heard his wife screaming, he rushed to the scene. The old woman's cat died behind the firewood after being poisoned by rat poison. Suddenly there was a loud noise coming from the room where the old woman's body was found. The son thought his mother was still alive. He was upbeat. He dashed in there to check and his wife followed him. When they arrived, they were both taken aback. The mother was standing tall in front of them, as if nothing had happened. The daughter-in-law became nervous, but the son still believed his mother was alive, so he called out to her. Suddenly, the old woman turned around, her face disfigured into that of a cat, complete with bright green eyes and fangs. When she saw the two of them, she squealed like a cat and became extremely angry. Her face looked extremely frightening. She pounced on them, her movements as quick as those of a cat. The terrified wife fled immediately, left her husband behind. Obviously, this was his mother's body, so the husband had no time to react out of astonishment. She was no longer a person at this point. Looked like the other cat had entered her body, and it didn't care who the son was anymore. It immediately attacked him with its claws. She pinned him down, unable to resist, and tore all of his flesh with her cat claws. He screamed for his mother to let him go, but to no avail. The cat seemed to hate him so much that it continued to tear up his flesh. At this point, the wife bolted, screaming for help as she ran. She ran through the neighbor's house, banging on the door, hoping that someone would save her. When neighbors heard the knock on the door, they gathered to see what was going on. After hearing her story, young men in the village took up some sticks and went over to investigate. They entered the gate and called for her husband, but no one answered, so they began to take precautions. As they dug deeper into the house, they noticed bloodstains on the ground. It looked like footprints started from inside the house. When they realized this, they let one of them to guard outside while the other two went inside the house. The dim lighting made it difficult for them to see their surroundings, but the stench of blood was unbearable. The husband's body gradually appeared under the bright moonlight, causing them to panic. His body and face were ripped apart by deep scratches, and it appeared that he was extremely terrified before he died. They were startled when they heard a loud noise outside. They all dashed out to check. They were now frozen by the scene. The old woman was sitting on the roof, but her posture was that of a cat. With a cat's face, its big mouth full of sharp teeth, it looked at everyone and then squealed ferociously. Then she fled from house to house, then vanished. Now the daughter-in-law also became insane. Chickens and ducks in the village, as well as the children, were being stolen. The village chief was expecting that the children would be found soon. Captain Chow stated that they would stay for 2 days in order to investigate the case. The village chief was overjoyed and he arranged for them to stay at the village guest home. Following that, the two of them began to split up and patrol the village at night. There were still no leads by the second night, and the captain kept patrolling the area. Suddenly, he noticed someone acting suspiciously. He had his face covered and a sack in his hand. He exited from a resident's house, looked like a thief. Captain Chow immediately came forward to ask for clarification, but he didn't seem to want to answer and appeared to be scared. The captain kicked him in the back just as he was about to flee, causing him to fall. He then rushed over to restrain him and question him about his behavior. He tied the guy up and went to look inside the sack and discovered that he was the one who abducted children in the village. The captain returned the child to the family before escorting the criminal away. He heard screams and gunshots on his way back to his room. Knowing something had happened to his comrade, he quickly tied the kidnapper to a tree and fled to the site. When the captain arrived at the location and saw that his comrade had been seriously injured on the arm, he inquired about the situation. When the comrade saw the captain, he quickly informed about the situation. He noticed a person sitting in the corner while patrolling the village. When he approached the person to inquire, she suddenly turned her face. It was the old woman possessed by a cat, and she was eating a raw chicken. In the dark, her eyes glowed with a frightening green light, so he quickly pulled out his gun and asked her to surrender, but she seemed to not understand what he was saying. She threw the half-eaten chicken to his face. He reached out his hand reflexively to prevent it. She rushed to attack him at that precise moment. She was lightning fast, her nails were razor sharp, and she broke his arm in deep cuts. Not allowing her to flee, the officer quickly turned around and fired a gunshot at her. The bullet struck on her right shoulder, causing her to howl in agony. Captain Chow bandaged his shady comrade and they both pursued the elderly woman. But there was no trace of her, only a pool of blood found on the ground. The captain returned to the headquarters and ordered a large number of police officers to search for her because she was injured and couldn't run far. Very soon after receiving intelligence, the police arrested and shot an elderly cat-faced woman, transporting her to the headquarters for forensic examination. Both of them, as well as Boss Lu Feng, were summoned to confirm whether or not it was her. Forensic removed the white sheet and Boss Lu Feng summoned the captain and his comrade to come and identify them. Because of her frightening appearance, they could identify her just by looking at the first sight. It was a cat-faced old lady with numerous bullet wounds on her body. According to the investigation, the children were also discovered, and the person who was arrested was a trafficker who had nothing to do with the cat-faced old lady. Rumors and articles about the elderly woman were widely circulated at the time. It was exaggerated so much that people still mention it years later.